Penistone's impressive railway viaduct is the most iconic feature of this bustling Yorkshire market town.
Over the years, it has seen its fair share of incidents.
And in this video, we're going to delve into a tragedy that occurred on this viaduct in September 1884.
And work out how an unfortunate young man came to lose his life.
At around 9:50 p.m. on Tuesday the 9th of September 1884, a young man by the name of Elliott Hawkyard fell 85 feet from the viaduct above us and plunged to his death just yards from where we're standing.
So in this video, we're going to be covering why Elliott was stood on this viaduct in the first place.
We're going to look at why he fell to his death and what, if any, lessons were learned in terms of railway safety.
So come and join us on another path to the past.
Tuesday the 9th of September had been a sombre day in Elliott Hawkyard's household. He'd been to a place called Big Valley near South Crossland near Huddersfield to attend the funeral of his maternal grandfather.
And sometime after 7 o'clock, he left the wake to get the train from Berrybrow to Penistone.
The plan was to arrive at Penistone station just before 10 p.m, then walk the mile or so to his lodgings in nearby Thurleston.
So at 9:50 p.m, the train pulled up on this viaduct to wait for access to Penistone station.
That's right, quite often the signal would be at red and the train would have to wait a few minutes before being allowed into the station. In the few minutes between the train pulling up outside the station and then being allowed into the station, Elliott Hawkyard had left his carriage, stood on the parapet above us and fallen to his death.
Fellow passengers reported the incident as soon as they went into Penistone station.
And two railway servants, as they were called at the time, a man named John Froggatt, another man we think was called Linfield, formed a search party and found Elliott's body about 100 yards behind us at the foot of the viaduct. Instantaneous death on impact. This was confirmed by a Dr. Wilson. Surprisingly, there was very little blood. He just had a small cut to his head, but he was quite dead.
Yes, sadly, he was found face down near the Little Don River.
So due to the fact that an inquest was held 2 days later, we have several witness statements and we're able to piece together the last few hours of Elliott Hawkyard's life.
And in doing so, we think we can come to a conclusion how Elliott met his death that night.
So the foreman of the jury was a man called Henry Heppenstall, a name still familiar in Penistone today. Also appearing at the inquest were several employees of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway and friends and family of Elliott Hawkyard, as well as passengers who'd been on the train that fateful evening. So it was established that Elliott Hawkyard had lived in the Penistone area for about 6 years. Previous to that, he'd been a native of the Huddersfield area. Initially working as a carter at the Wentworth Arms, for the past 4 years he'd worked as a labourer at the large Yorkshire Steel and Iron Works, just a few yards from where he met his death.
At the time of his death, he was lodging in Smithy Fold in Thurleston.
So the first witness called at the inquest, of which we have detailed handwritten notes still available online, was a man by the name of Brooke Hawkyard, Elliott's father.
So on the day, Brooke said
his son was in good health and spirits.
But he also emphasised that Elliott was quite sober.
Significantly, he also mentioned that Elliott was nearsighted.
And Brooke's final words to his son on that fateful day were not to be late catching a train from Huddersfield to Penistone. Now, Brooke's final piece of testimony, before he signed it here in his own hand, as you can see, was that Elliott's life had been insured for the last 8 or 9 years in the office of the Prudential Association and Company Limited. Therefore, the coroner's inquest had an important job in deciding whether this was a case of suicide or accidental death. Now, having family in Huddersfield but living and working in the Penistone area, it was established that Elliott Hawkyard was a regular user of this line. In fact, quoting from the inquest,
he was well acquainted with the line and the viaduct.
So the next witness called was a lady who knew Elliott Hawkyard well. She was called Jane Caldwell and she lived in Thurleston, just round the corner from Elliott, and she was a landlady of the Crystal Palace Inn.
And she reported that Elliott was a frequent patron of the inn.
So Jane had boarded the train at Brockhall station, entering a third-class smoking compartment, and there she saw Elliott and 3 other men who she didn't know.
Yes, she testified that many people got in and out of the carriages at the different stops.
Now, Jane herself left that third-class carriage because of the amount of smoke in there. She really didn't like the atmosphere. and she made that move at Denbydale station. So when she left the compartment, she reported there was just Elliott in there and another man who was unknown to her. Now, Jane was at pains to point out that when she left the compartment, Elliott Hawkyard was sober. So Jane had moved herself to a compartment further to the front of the train, and she said she had her back to the engine. So as the train pulled along the viaduct and stopped, she was facing that way. And she reported that when she looked out of her carriage to her right, so the other side of this viaduct, she saw Elliott standing on the parapet.
So Jane reported that she'd also seen another passenger get out of the carriage and walk along the track bed towards Hoyland Swain in that direction.
Yeah, the train had been waiting quite a while, and I think that man, whose name was Charles Lockwood, had grown impatient, jumped out the carriage and walked in that direction. So I think Elliott Hawkyard had seen this, and he too had grown impatient, so he decided he was going to get out the carriage and not wait for the train to pull in the station. Now, Jane actually saw this and warned him of the danger of doing so.
So she claims to have seen Elliott and said, "Don't go down there."
We can surmise that she's opened her carriage window, maybe to get some fresh air, waiting for the train to go in the station, and seen her acquaintance Elliott stood on the parapet above us. But before he had time to reply, he slipped and fell to his death. So what might be in the thoughts of the jury at this point? Is this a case of suicide? Is this a case of inebriation? Or is this just a case of short-sightedness and misjudgment?
So let's dig further into the evidence.
A Mr. Stanley from Denbydale, and he must have known Elliott Hawkyard because he said that Elliott seemed in his usual state, and I do not think he intended to do anything to himself.
So John, there's 3 different witnesses who reported that they'd seen Elliott and he was in his normal state.
That's right, they're all claiming that there was absolutely no hint of suicide about this case at all. So what else do we know about that evening? Well, it was 9:50 in the middle of September, so it was dark. However, it's reported there was quite a lot of bright moonlight, and there was also light coming from the Camel Laird Steelworks where Elliott Hawkyard actually worked. So there was reasonable light on that viaduct, hence the witnesses being able to describe what they saw happening. Another witness by the name of George Naylor reported that he'd seen the first man get out the carriage, Charles Lockwood, and walk along the viaduct in that direction behind us, and he'd also seen Elliott Hawkyard get out and fall to his death. So then it was the turn of the railway employees to give their testimony. So the driver of the engine was a man called James Edmondson, and he said in all his time driving up and down this section of railway, he'd never known of anybody get out at the viaduct. But this is the point in the inquest where the railway company employees start to shift the blame onto Elliott Hawkyard for his own death.
Yeah, so James Edmondson said that it would have taken a considerable stride to get from the carriage onto the parapet.
Yeah, so he's implying that Elliott Hawkyard deliberately went onto the parapet, and he wasn't there by accident or misjudgment. So another witness was a man by the name of Henry Watts, and he lived in Brockholes, and he was a clerk in the employment of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. He said the carriage footboard would be a good 3 foot 6 inches away from the parapet.
So once again, they're saying that Elliott must have made some effort to get up onto it.
That's right. So at this point, the members of the jury decided to leave the Wentworth Arms and asked to actually view the viaduct from the top to look at these measurements themselves. In fact, they actually took a measurer with them. The coroner's summing up seemed to steer the jury away from a verdict of suicide. So on returning to the Wentworth Arms from the viaduct, it didn't take the jury long to come to a verdict of accidental death. Yeah, so not suicide, and no blame attached to Elliott Hawkyard in any degree for his own tragic death. They did actually comment that they thought there should be some railings put up there at the top of the viaduct because they considered the viaduct in its present state was unsafe. Now, we don't know whether that action was actually put into place by the railway company, but maybe somebody out there knows. Do you know if there are any alterations made to this viaduct after the tragedy of 1884?
On looking above me, I don't seem to see any railings up there today.
But Dawn, there's one key witness missing from all this, isn't there?
And who is that?
That is the other man in the carriage with Elliott Hawkyard. When he got out, went onto the parapet and fell to his death.
Surely he would be called as a witness.
Yeah, he was a 47-year-old man by the name of Joel Midwood, and he lived in the Walkley area of Sheffield. Now, he actually read all these reports of the inquest in the newspaper, and he was a bit puzzled because he had actually given his name and address to the station master when the train had pulled into the station. So for whatever reason, maybe in the confusion of the tragedy, his name had not been forwarded to the coroner, and therefore he hadn't been called as a witness, but he did give his testimony to the newspapers in the week after Elliott's death.
So it appears that this is the definitive account of the person who last saw Elliott alive.
That's right. So again, Joel Midwood was at pains to emphasise that he did not think that this was a case of suicide, and he'd be in the best position to know. So Joel Midwood said that when the train stopped, he actually opened the carriage window to look outside, and at this point Elliott was sort of lying on a seat, still smoking. So Joel then mentioned to Elliott Hawkyard that he'd actually seen another passenger get out and walk along the viaduct. So Elliott's response was, well, if he's getting out, then I'm getting out here too.
So Joel tried to dissuade him from getting out of the carriage.
So Joel thought that Elliott would get out of the carriage and jump straight onto the track bed, but what Elliott actually did was step out of the carriage and a little jump onto the parapet wall, which he may or may not have thought was the actual platform of the station. But then maybe not, because he went on this line very often and was familiar with the viaduct. Anyway, Joel saw Elliott totter slightly on the wall, trying to recover his balance for a couple of seconds before losing his footing and falling to his death. And one final point from Joel Midwood, which is slightly at odds with what Jane Caldwell and Brooke Hawkyard actually said. He reckoned that Elliott had had a drink, but definitely wasn't drunk. He also mentioned that the amount of smoke in the carriage, he used a sort of late Victorian phrase that he felt that Elliott might have been a little bit stupid from all the smoke.
So in conclusion, we've ruled out suicide.
Absolutely, definitely ruled out suicide. What still hangs in the air is a possibility of a little lightheadedness from the smoke, possibly a little drink, but that's unclear. Possibly a little bit of nearsightedness. So it was night time, yes, there was some moonlight, but maybe he misjudged how far he had to get out of the carriage onto the parapet, and perhaps a little bit of lack of railway safety, because that was certainly picked up by the jury and recommendations made to make this viaduct safer. So there we go, folks, the tragic death of Elliott Hawkyard on this viaduct. We hope you found this video interesting. If you are from Penistone, maybe you'll think of poor Elliott next time you're down at the park. If you visit Penistone, maybe you'll take some time to visit the viaduct and remember the circumstances of that tragic day in September 1884.
So we hope that you can join us next time, where every journey begins with a path to the past.